Hi, everyone. Boy, I always felt so bad for people who were told last minute they have to present. But here I am. So I'm Denitsa Ivanova. I have about 15 years of corporate responsibility, ESG experience across a very wide spectrum. I started on the investment side at BlackRock, Stanford University's endowment fund, and then I worked on the energy side, and my last job was at a regional bank, basically building and running an ESG and corporate responsibility program from scratch. Just turn this off.
Button at the top, I think. Maybe flip it around. Or is it off?
I think it's off.
Let me see.
This is dangerous. You're putting me in charge of tech, but I think there's a button here. There we go. And then
Oh, okay. Thank you. So like most of you here, I've had, okay, I think we're good.
And then point it this way.
This way?
Yeah, I mean, it'll help, yeah.
Okay, I think we're good. So like most of you here, I've had this front row seat to what I would call an ESG evolution, because it started as something so niche and aspirational, and it turned into this thing that every company feels it has to talk about and participate in. So today I want to reflect on how this momentum built up, why it shifted, and how do we go from here into actually building authentic and resilient ESG programs. So let's dive in. So let's be honest, a lot has changed over the last 6 months. Only a couple of years ago, ESG was everywhere. Boards wanted it, investors were asking for more disclosure, employees were proud about the kind of commitments their companies were putting out. Now, fast forward to now, those of you who work on the corporate side, how many organizations here have quietly softened or rebranded their ESG language over the last 6 months? A couple of hands, we did that, okay. I think almost everyone did some version of this. And it's not because what was important before it no longer exists, right? We haven't fixed climate change or social inequality. But when I talk to people, it kind of comes down to ESG, the term ESG, just being very complicated and just polarizing. So let's unpack this. What happened to ESG? I think if we look at the trajectory of how ESG evolved, I think it started very slowly at first, and then it surged, probably around 2021, as we were kind of slowly moving away from the pandemic. Companies were very eager to show that they were doing the right thing. So ESG funds, investment ESG funds were just growing at a rapid pace. A regulation was proposed, and everyone was just, including myself, were just very quickly building and developing and scaling their ESG programs. Then there was a backlash. I think first caught winds around 2023, when I think comptrollers, a couple of red states started suing BlackRock and divesting from companies like BlackRock and Vanguard because of ESG. And then 2024, there was, the election cycle. ESG got caught up in that, and regulation paused or got killed, depending on who you're asking. And the funds that were previously growing, now capital was being pulled out of. So we're now in this reset period where companies are not exactly stepping away from their commitments, but they're also not making new ones. And I think especially at a smaller company size right now, everyone is in this kind of wait and see period where everything is being reassessed. If ESG is no longer this hot thing that everyone is asking about, or there might not be regulation for certain companies, what do we do with ESG? So let's talk about ESG itself. What happened to ESG? I don't think we can blame politics entirely on what happened to ESG. I think it had a lot of flaws that caught up to it before the elections last year. I think for once it meant too many things to too many people, or it was really trying to be everything for everyone, and it started to lose its clarity. Then there were the rising expectations. Now, I'm sure that most of you are probably burned by this one. You know, your stakeholders' demand for data coming in faster than your company can deliver it. And the big one was greenwashing. Well, I know a lot of companies got in trouble for this one, just putting out aspirations and goals without actually having the internal processes and infrastructure to support them. So I think naturally, this skepticism around ESG has been growing for a long time. And this is also why I think that this moment right now of kind of pausing everything is actually healthy and actually good for ESG. I think what we're seeing right now is actually ESG growing up. I think these are kind of the growing pains that we're experiencing. I know a lot of people interpret this moment as ESG cooling off. I think if you read the Financial Times over the last year, I think they killed it at least 5 times, predicted that it will die this year. But I don't see it this way. I don't think ESG is fading. I think it's actually concentrating. Because I've been looking at a lot of ESG reports over the last 6 months, probably a couple of hundred reports across different industries and sectors and sizes of companies, small, mid-size, large. And I wanted to see what are the shifts that are currently emerging in this space. And there are a couple of things that I noticed. For once, I think most of the companies that published a report last year are also publishing a report this year. So there was this continuation. The report was a couple of pages shorter this year, I think 2 to 3 pages on average than it was the year before. And also the term ESG, I think if it went up, I think in 2021, I read a report that the usage of the term ESG in 2021 was up 80% from the prior year. So I think now it has gone down. I don't know if it's by the same factor, but it has come down substantially. You know, so ESG was always kind of a buzzword, and we can see that this buzzword has come down substantially this year. And in general, there's just been so much less noise around ESG this year. So there were fewer pages, less buzzwords, fewer sweeping promises. There were companies who, to their credit, did stand behind their promises and offered more realistic plans. But I think that this is what maturity actually looks like for ESG. I think programs that are actually smaller and more credible and clearer than they ever were during the height of the momentum phase. So how do you know when an ESG program has actually matured? I think the clearest sign is this: it stops performing ESG and it starts reflecting the organization as it is. I think the early ESG programs were very outward facing. So what are others doing? What do we put in a report that makes us look good? And I think for mature programs actually shift inward. So they're built around the company's real business model, priorities, and culture. And I think that this kind of authenticity is actually the clearest proof of maturity. When, because you know that the program is no longer rooted in optics. It's actually rooted in reality. So I think that what we're seeing right now, it's actually the beginning of more authentic ESG programs. So when I think about ESG, there are three words that come to mind: credibility, consistency, and coherence. So credibility really has to do with data, just standing up, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, standing up to scrutiny. Consistency has to do with our message not shifting depending on the audience or the type of disclosure, so that we don't say one thing to our investors and another thing to our customers. And coherence is about our story lining up with our operations, so that we don't sound like one company on paper and another one in practice. And the one question that we always asked ourselves internally was, where does our external message exceed our internal reality? Because I think it's a very crucial question, because in this gap between what we say and what we actually do, I think this is where credibility cracks start to form. So going back to scanning all of the reports for different shifts this year, I think one of the most constructive shifts that I've seen this year is actually companies reframing ESG through the lens of resilience. And when I say this, I don't mean actually swapping one label for the other, one buzzword for the other, which a lot of companies literally did this. So this is not what I mean. I mean, it's actually the shift in mindset. The shift from actually thinking of ESG as something, as the buzzword that we just sprinkle on everything, to the thing that actually gives a company its staying power. So, because when you think about resilience is about being durable and being steady and being able to hold direction over time, which is exactly where ESG is being challenged right now. And I think if you see ESG in that same fashion as being able to hold direction over time, it stops being about a buzzword and it just becomes about the long-term health of the organization. And so I think the idea of resilience is, it's really great in theory, but what does resilience really look like? I didn't want this to be just another buzzword. So I wanted to really unpack what it means to have a resilient program. And I think I think the most important thing is for ESG to be actually a strategic fit to the company. And being a strategic fit is connected to how the company creates value or how it makes money. So, and this one is so important, so basic, yet I see companies get this one wrong all the time. And for us, as a bank, I think a lot of people argue that ESG is kind of tricky to integrate at that level, especially on the social side, because our value as a bank comes from lending money and from servicing our community. As a bank, we actually have an obligation to provide certain services to the communities where we're doing business. So on the social side, we focus on the things that naturally supported this. And kind of a perfect example here is financial education. Providing financial education as a voluntary service to our communities is just such a win-win, because there's there are great outcomes when we equip people with that kind of knowledge, with financial literacy. Those are also people that we bring into the banking system, people who would eventually become our clients. So there's definitely a win-win. But it was also something that helped us during our regulatory exams. Gave us enough brownie points that actually helped through these exams. But I think the one part that was often overlooked was the kind of goodwill that we were building in the community because of this act of actually providing these volunteer services. And this was the kind of goodwill that you get to cash in on when you're going through a merger and you need an application to get enough approval quickly. So we were an organization that grew through mergers and acquisitions. So we went through those quite frequently. And the one thing that we never had to deal with was actually advocacy groups stepping in and trying to block our application because of the goodwill that we built because of these programs. So I think this is kind of a perfect example of ESG actually being used as a strategic fit, not as a charity or just window dressing, but just very much aligned to how we created value as an organization. So the other very important thing is the clear ownership. So I think that strong programs need to have defined owners at the board level, at the executive level, and within the teams. So board oversight, I know it gets discussed a lot because of regulations, so I won't focus too much on this one. And the team ownership, or how ESG data gets mapped out across the organization, I know this is widely discussed topic as well. I think the one thing that doesn't get enough attention, and it should, is the executive ownership. So this is actually, in my experience, having an executive sponsor to the program. So someone who is high enough in the company, who is truly invested in the success of the company, is really the make or break factor. So I think when you have that, then things happen. resources show up, approvals happen much faster, and they can also advocate for the work of the ESG team in different places where the ESG team isn't even in. So they can advocate for it in the boardroom. And so this has been a really huge, that kind of support has made a huge difference for our program. Data integrity, I think, is kind of an obvious one. I'm sure a lot of you here have experienced this one firsthand. I know for us, when our data lived in our emails and spreadsheets and different people's inboxes, then we just couldn't answer a basic question consistently. And it's not because people weren't trying, it was just that we didn't have a single source of truth. So this is also where paying and investing in a really good reporting platform actually makes a difference. So I'm not here advertising any kind of solutions. I know there are a lot of good options out there. But this is once we centralized everything and we put controls around everything, this is where we were actually finally able to stand behind our numbers. I think if you don't have good data that's reliable, then you can't make decisions, and you can't build trust and credibility externally as well as internally. Internally especially, I think there's nothing worse than leadership reaching out and asking for a number and then getting 3 different versions of that from 3 different teams, which used to happen to us actually quite frequently. So the other thing I wanted to touch on is the message discipline. So this one is not about PR, it's about alignment. So for us, it was about making sure that our employees were not surprised by our commitments. And I think this is a really good rule of thumb, is that your employees should never open up your report and be surprised by anything in it. I think they should read it in recognition, like, yeah, I've been part of this. I know someone who was part of this, or they always talk about this one, so I know it's true. I think the case should never be like, oh my God, my company is doing so amazing. How do I not know about this? I think if that happens, then there's a messaging misalignment, and you need a messaging discipline to kind of protect trust inside and outside the organization, and also to avoid greenwashing. That kind of saying one thing and doing another, it's kind of a textbook greenwashing. Left the best one for last, the operational integration. So I would just say this, for us, integration became real when ESG stopped being an annual data collection project, and it started showing up in different conversations. In conversations about how we are vetting our vendors, how we're underwriting our loans, how we're choosing insurance, how we're selecting event venues. So these were conversations that were driven by other teams. And I think this is a really solid sign of integration, is when other people are actually bringing ESG considerations to you, not the other way around. So I think this is kind of what it takes. These are the fundamentals that you need in place to ensure that kind of resilience of your program. And I think once you have these in place, everything else actually becomes a lot more manageable. So the fundamentals matter, but most companies actually don't start there. They start right here on the compliance side, on the left side. And I think that's normal. I think most of us were probably there or still there. But the problem is that a lot of companies get stuck in compliance, and basically in just this reactive mode of just reporting and responding and just chasing what's being required. And what moves you out of compliance and into capability is structure. So the kind of structure that we just talked about, the defined roles, the better processes, the cleaner data. This is really what shifts the work from the few people in the ESG team to the organization itself. And then what gets you from capability into strategy is integration. So this is when the work starts showing up in planning and in risk discussions and operational decisions. It's when it stops being a report and it really becomes part of how the company runs. So everything I've talked about so far, maturity, the authenticity, the strategic fit, naturally leads here at integration. And I know before we started having ESG being integrated across the company, I know that things felt very fragmented. So things were happening, but they were not connected. But then once the fundamentals that we discussed, once they start getting stronger, then something shifted. Then, the work stops living in these pockets. Things were kind of lining up. And that's when integration started showing up. So I was trying to think, well, how do we frame integration? How do we do integration? And to be honest, we never actually did integration. It was never a project. I think it was really the outcome of having all of these fundamentals actually being, when you set up these kind of guardrails and you have enough clarity around the program, this is when integration actually starts showing up. So it's not a project or a milestone or something that can be accomplished in Q1 or Q2. So I think this is really the moment when ESG stops being the annual ESG report and it just becomes how the company runs. So a couple of takeaways that I'm going to leave you with. I think these are the most important things that I touched on today. I think the first one is that ESG only works when it's real. So this is when your story matches your behavior internally and externally, then people believe you, and this kind of alignment is really the foundation. Without that foundation, then nothing can stick. Then resilience is not a separate project or a task. It's really the outcome of having that strong foundation. It's really what happens when ESG is so grounded in the business that it can withstand changes to politics and regulations, marketing sentiment shifts. That's what resilience is meant to do. And integration is what makes all of that possible. It's when ESG sits inside the decisions and not besides them, it becomes part of how the business runs. And this is what helps drive performance and the long-term value and stability. And across all of this, consistency is what actually builds trust. So not perfection, but really consistency, which comes down to showing up the same way in your commitments and in your disclosures and in your operations. So I started today by saying that ESG has shifted, and I'll end by saying this shift is not the end of ESG. It's really the beginning of ESG becoming something that is built to last. Thank you all.